So realism had become kind of the way things were done in theater, or at least in uh, respectable cutting edge theater. And around the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, some people started pushing it a little bit further. And that's where we come into what is today called naturalism. We have a separate name for it because, well, it's a it's kind of like the way I like to look at naturalism. Naturalism is basically like super realism. It's like realism on steroids. It's like if somebody said, okay, you want to see something real, let's make it dreadfully real. It was very pessimistic, very hard to get through. But for a long time, people felt like this was more real to be able to say, let's face reality in all of its ugliest forms. Now, a lot of this was influenced by Charles Darwin. If you don't know who he is, talk to your science teacher. But long story short, for our purposes here, Darwin was a scientist that created the idea that species evolved according to their own abilities, and the strongest would survive. And one of the things that he basically was able to say is that human beings are nothing special. We're just another kind of animal. Now, that influenced the way people looked at reality, the idea that we are just another kind of animal that has the same kind of needs that other animals have, of needing to survive, needing to propagate our species, and stuff like this. And it kind of took away some of the idea that human beings are something special, that our spirits, our emotions made us different than other animals. So naturalism was very, very bleak. And a lot of times, naturalists would argue that a person's character was created entirely by their heredity, by what they got from their parents, and by their environment. So usually people, when they talk about your character, they will talk about those things affecting them, but your free will was really what created your character. In other words, if you grow up in a terrible place around terrible, terrible people, that doesn't mean that you have to be terrible, because you can choose not to. Naturalists argued that that wasn't real, that there was no free will. Free will was an illusion, that you think you have your free will, but really your character is created by heredity and environment. So very, very depressing idea. Naturalism also tended to have a very blunt picture of sexuality and poverty and crime. All of these things were looked at as just the natural byproduct of human beings being animals. And so all of these things were looked at as in a very depressing way, very, very pessimistic, just very pessimistic. I don't care for naturalism myself. I can't take too much of it. There are some great naturalist plays, and some people love this stuff. I can't stand it. I can't stand the kind of pessimistic, everything is terrible kind of things. It makes me want to scream. So, but many people love this stuff. So, yes, and one thing naturalism did a lot of is attacking social conventions. They would look at people that consider themselves to be very important or very masters of society, sort of thing, and they would say this is very hypocritical. These are people that pretend to be good, but on the inside they are really dark and horrible. And so again, very, very pessimistic. Now, I want to talk about just one play that came out of this time period, one playwright and one play that he wrote. The playwright's name is August Strindberg. Now, some people consider Strindberg to be a realism playwright, but most of the plays by Strindberg are actually much more into what we call naturalism. Very, very blunt, very pessimistic. And that is certainly true of the play that I want to tell you about now, the play that he wrote, which is called Miss Julie. So the main character of Miss Julie is Miss Julie. Miss Julie is a high-class woman. She has a father who's only called the Count, who never really shows up in the play, but his presence is always kind of there. So Miss Julie is very high class, and she kind of is defined by that. And she's a little sick of that. She's kind of tired of being stuck into this high-class world. So at one point, she goes to a party that's made for the servants. And she goes there on purpose to try to escape social mores. It's like she's going slumming. And she meets this guy, Jean.
or Jean, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that. But anyway, Jean is an older man. He's older than she is, and he is a servant. In fact, he kind of works for her dad. Anyway, they fall in love, and I would suggest it's a lot more of lust. In a lot of ways, Jean is using her, but then in a lot of ways, Miss Julie is also using him. In fact, the play is very much concerned with power. Who has the power in this relationship? Because on the one hand, he is a man, and he is older, so that means he has the power. But on the other hand, she is higher class, and her father basically employs him. So who has the power in this relationship is a big part of what's going on. So they have this little affair. It doesn't last very long. In fact, the whole play only takes about 2 days. But when it becomes obvious that they can't hide their affair, Miss Julie tries to find her way out of it. And what she's realizing is that no matter what she tries to do, it's kind of being taught to her by somebody else. Her mother, for example, taught her never to just go where a man takes her, and to be her own person. But that's not her being her own person. That's following her mom. All of the social stuff of her class is brought to her by her class. Everything that she tries to do to be her own person, to express free will, is impossible because every option is hereditary. So she's trying to find her way out of this. She talks about maybe the two of them running away together. Jean, in the first place, doesn't seem all that excited about doing that, partly because he knows that her father will then, punish them both for it. But basically, she comes to the point where she says, is there anything I can do that's actually me doing it? Or is it all just what my daddy expects, or what my mom expects, or what society expects? Is there anything that she can do on her own to get out of this situation? And Jean is the one that actually suggests there's really only one way out of this that is uniquely only yours. And he takes out his razor, which is a straight razor, and hands it to her. And the suggestion is suicide is the only way out. And she leaves the stage, presumably to go and kill herself, and that is the end of the play. Now, the ironic thing about this is that even in this, she's not exercising her free will, because she's only doing that because Jean suggested it. Still, though, very depressing, very naturalistic.
So that was naturalism, and naturalism continued for quite a while. And at this point, we start seeing a lot of different kinds of theater kind of happening around the same time. Realism was still there. Romanticism was still there, because Shakespeare was still the most popular playwright of all time. And we now had some naturalism, and we also had another thing. And these were all kind of happening at once. We had this kind of multiplicity of different theatrical traditions. And this was called Expressionism. Now, Expressionism is not just a theatrical tradition, it's also an art tradition. And Expressionism in theater was kind of an early response to realism. People looked at realism and they thought that this was didn't fully say the story, because we human beings don't face reality the same way that you would face reality if you were just taking a picture of it. And so they created something called Expressionism, which was basically trying to show meaning, but instead of just trying to show what it was really happening, they would show distorted pictures to express emotions. Great example is this piece of art you see right here. This is called The Scream by Edvard Munch. And you notice that nobody looks like this. This character here isn't reality. You see all the swirling stuff and everything like that. That isn't how people really look. And yet it expresses that emotion of somebody screaming in terror or horror. That look on that person's face is very striking and creates, it kind of expresses, I should say, an emotion in a way that just showing a person screaming doesn't. So usually the emotion they're after is what's called angst. Now, most of you don't need to be told what angst is. If you do, angst is kind of it's a frustration with how the world is, with how the world is very depressing and hard, kind of mixed up with a lot of, it's almost near to depression. But angst tends to also be very, very angry. So you're frustrated, you want things to change, but you just can't see how they would change, and that's angst. Today, we usually hear the word angst when people are talking about teenagers, because it's a feeling a lot of teenagers feel when they look at the world and are frustrated that the world isn't as good as you feel like it should be. Um, so expressionism dealt with a lot of angst, often expressing frustration with society and especially financial inequality. In other words, the idea that there are those that are very, very rich, and there's also people that are starving to death in poverty. And how can we ever make that the same? Um, the same kind of feeling eventually works into a lot of political movements as well. But that's something for your history teacher to tell you about. I'm going to talk about some plays that were written that are expressionist. Some of these were very, very good. Also, though, I will mention some of them are quite depressing and they don't have a very positive view of human nature. So, the first writer from this time period, from uh, this sort of theater, I suppose, that I want to mention, is one you've already met, August Strindberg. August Strindberg, you know, as a naturalist writer. Well, he wasn't only a naturalist writer, he also got into expressionism. His work is still bleak. Um, and the works that he's writing they're not quite as bleak as Miss Julie. Miss Julie is pretty darn bleak. But August Strindberg was bleak in his expressionism as well. And the play I want you to know about that he wrote that was an expressionist play is called A Dream Play. Now, I'm going to try to describe what happens here, but I will start off by saying this whole play feels like if you've ever had a really bad fever, been really, really sick, and then you start dreaming, you fall asleep and start dreaming, and everything's really distorted and strange, the play feels that way. A dream play feels like the kind of dream you would have when you were sick. A lot of it doesn't make sense. But it's not meant to make sense. It's meant to just bring up powerful emotions. In any case, though, let me explain to you basically what happens.
The main character in August Strindberg's A Dream Play is this character named Agnes. Agnes is the daughter of the Vedic god Indra, and she is descending down onto the earth to try to bear witness to what human life is. And perhaps because Agnes is not from our world, everything has a quality of dream. In fact, Strindberg specified that he deliberately made this not fit the well-made play stereotype of how a realist play is supposed to look. And instead he made it feel more like it was a dream. Everything is unreal. But she meets all sorts of characters, probably about 40 or 50 different characters, and those characters are frequently very metaphorical. For example, Agnes meets these 4 guys that represent 4 different kinds of learning. She meets them at this kind of dream-like university thing, and their names are like philosophy, theology, I don't know, science and math. I don't know. You get the idea, though, is that they're named kind of similar to how you would see it in a medieval morality play. But she meets these guys and they're idiots. And they argue with each other and fight with each other and don't seem to have any idea what they're talking about ever. And she looks at these people and says, this is the learning of human beings. Human beings are to be pitied. And in fact, that's her quote that she goes back to again and again, and eventually that is her summary of the entire experience of being human. Human beings are to be pitied. You should feel bad for human beings. She meets lots of other things that happen. She sees a lot of terrible things that happen in human beings. She sees poverty, with people like starving and hunger. She sees people being cruel to each other and horrible to each other like that, and says, "Oh, human beings are to be pitied." She also sees happy families, families that are mother and father and children. And they're bored, and they're just doing the same things day in and day out. And she says, this is also pitiable, and human beings are to be pitied. And eventually she ascends back up to heaven to speak to her father, the God, and basically tells him that that is her summary of all human life, is that human life is pitiable and sad, and these poor beings that live down here on the earth, we ought to just pity them. And that's basically the end of the play.
So that's A Dream Play. Now, the other writer that I want you to know about from this time period is also He also angsty, but not quite as much so as August Strindberg, and that guy's name was Eugene O'Neill. Now, Eugene O'Neill was August Strindberg was a European. I want to say he was Swedish. I don't remember, but Eugene O'Neill is the first major playwright we're talking about that was an American. And the play that he wrote is called Hairy Ape. And the Hairy Ape is very much a play about Americans. In fact, as you'll notice, the main character's name is Yank, which is a reference to Yankees, which is what a lot of people called Americans. So a lot of this is dealing with what it's like to be American. There's a lot of other things going on there, very angsty expressionist stuff. Let me explain to you that play now.
All right, the main character in The Hairy Ape is a man named Yank. Yank is a fireman on an ocean liner ship. Basically what that means is that he shovels coal into the furnace to keep the ship going. Now again, this is expressionism. There's a bit of a metaphor. The ship is kind of being rowed around by the rich people, but it takes the big, strong, poor people underneath to keep it moving. So a little metaphor there. But he's very proud of himself because he's big and he's strong and he's kind of a leader among the other firemen because of his strength, and he's kind of proud of who he is. Until he runs into a woman named Mildred. Now Mildred, at first, she has a scene where she's on top of the ship, and she's this socialite rich person that wants to find some way to help the poor, suffering people of the world, who she really doesn't know anything about at all. But she decides she's going to go down to the bowels of the ship and see if she can help them in some way. And when she goes down there, she runs into Yank, kind of surprises him. He turns around yelling at somebody else and then sees her there. She sees this big, hairy, strong-looking man and is terrified of him. She says, oh, it's a hairy ape! And she faints. And Yank is all kind of offended by this and stuff like this. Later on in another scene, it shows him with some other people around, his other fellow firemen, and you see that he's actually quite disturbed by this. He's disturbed by the idea that this woman that basically depends on him and his fellow firemen to keep their ship running sees him as just this hairy ape. He's kind of offended by this, and he's kind of decides he kind of wants to get revenge on this rich society thing. These guys, one of them says he's probably right, and the other one says, you should just let this go. But he doesn't take advice, and instead, when they get to when the ship docks, he goes off into the city, into Manhattan. And along the way, he ends up seeing some socialites coming out of church, people that remind him of Mildred. And so he gets angry at them, and because of his anger, he punches a guy in the face, and he gets arrested, and he gets thrown in jail. So he's in jail for 30 days or so, and while he's in jail, along with another guy, he talks to him about how I don't seem to fit in anywhere, and he says, you ought to join the International Workers of the World. It's kind of a union sort of thing, which again, when this was made, unions basically were communist organizations that were designed to try to take down the rich. And so he thinks about maybe he'll do that, but he also says he realizes as he's talking with the other prisoners in the jail, he said, perhaps I belong with you guys, and then he seems that they also don't accept him either. And so he's, I got to get out of here. He tries to bend the bars to get away, and a guard comes along and basically just kind of like knocks him back and won't let him do that, and so he has to serve the rest of his sentence. He finally does get out, and when he gets out, he does go to see this union that he was talked about, the International Workers of the World. And he goes in there and talks about how angry he is and how he wants to try to take down the rich socialites. And at first they're very glad to see him because they don't have any other firemen in the union. And so they're glad to see him, and they encourage him to do stuff. And then he keeps talking more and more about how he wants to take down the rich. He wants to like blow up buildings and stuff like this. And these guys start thinking that he's not genuine, that he's in fact a spy for the government trying to pull them down. And so they say, no, you are too extreme, and they kick him out. And so he realizes that he doesn't belong among them either. And then the last scene of the play, he's wandering through New York still, and he goes to the zoo. And he sees a gorilla sitting in a cage. And he basically says, maybe she was right all along. Maybe I am an ape. Maybe this is where I belong. I didn't belong with the rich. I didn't belong with the workers. I didn't belong with the people in prison. Maybe I really am just an animal. And so he releases the gorilla from its pen, and he tries to talk to it like it's his new friend. And the gorilla chokes him to death, and he dies. And that's the end of the play. So these are some depressing plays, aren't they? So the discussion I want you to talk about down below, is there any use in a really depressing play? Or would it be much better off if these were all happy? Think in your head if you can think of another really depressing story that's actually really meaningful to you. And if there is a play like that, or a movie or a TV show that's really quite depressing, but you also think it's meaningful and important, tell us about it down in the discussion down below. And then look around at the other people's ones, because if you've seen them too, you can say, yes, I agree. If you haven't seen them, you can say, that looks interesting, or anything like that. Anyway, enjoy.